Lewis's much more in-depth wash and rinse cycle that he put us it's really in our bones. So and this one is really, I hope, lighthearted. It's actually a really long joke. So yeah, let me start by introducing myself and then telling you a little bit about who I am and what I do. A lot of you have already seen all the books that I have in there. I actually have a degree in architecture from the University of Notre Dame. I have 6 children, aged 7 through 17, as well as a long-suffering husband, as you can well imagine. We homeschooled our children until my oldest, Emma, was in the 5th grade. And then we've done a mix of different schools, and actually, ironically, Emma is back at home doing Queen of Heaven Academy online. But you can see most of that's relatively normal up to now. But because God has this really wild sense of humor, I am now running a publishing company that has over 75 titles, and we're growing all the time. And so, of course, when people first meet me and they hear about what I do, one of the first things they want to know is, how on earth did you get started doing this? You're in architecture, and what, someday you just decide I have to publish books? And personally, I'd really like to know the answer to that question too. But I've got a couple excuses I can share with you. So I'm sure many of you had similar experiences to mine when I was growing up in the bad old 70s and 80s, and I still get a little bit of post-traumatic stress when I think about felt banners. So we won't talk about that. But the sad thing about growing up during that period was that our catechesis was, well, how might I say, a little lacking. I mean, we learned a lot of Jesus loves you. I've got that down pat. But it really wasn't until I was in my 20s and opera mad and I heard the opera Tosca that I ever heard the Angelus being prayed. And I didn't even know what that was. Or the Te Deum. I might have read about it in literature sometime when people were really happy they were saying the Te Deum, and I didn't know what that was. So, and it wasn't really until after our 4th child was born that I ever really attended the traditional Latin Mass. See, our family attended your typical urban wasteland parish where everything is comfortably bland. And at this particular parish, they had actually taken the narthex, which is the vestibule of the church, and completely glassed it off so that you could, and put a different lobby over on the side. So you could come in on the side, and families could just go into what used to be the narthex, which was now an enormous crying room that could fit, I gotta say, at least 30, 40 people in it. And in this giant cry room, the kids would just run around, and they would play, and they would bring all their toys and their coloring books, and they would do whatever. And of course, you've probably already, those of you who have been unlucky enough to go to, a lot of different sort of masses. One of the things that is in vogue is this children's liturgy of the word, where they actually remove the children from church, because of course they're so annoying, right? And they remove the children from the church until they miss the whole mass. So, this is what we were doing. And while this made things really easier for us when we were going to Mass, we really, once the kids were past the stage where they were, drooling all over things and crawling all over the floor and all of that, really, it was like, they need to know that they're at Mass. I mean, they don't even realize that they're at Mass. This is just a big room where they play, and they're not looking through the glass window and seeing what's in there. So, and then, worse than, we also were worried because they were getting old enough to notice some of the things that the parishioners were wearing, the cut-off jeans and the tank tops and the death metal t-shirts, and really beginning to wonder, what's that? So we got to the point where we realized that something had to be done, and we really weren't sure what. And you begin to become a mass tourist, right? You start going from church to church to church and trying to find some place that will feed you. And really, none of the churches in our area were qualitatively any better. They were just different flavors of bland and nothing. So it was at that time that I recalled a conversation I had many years previous when I was working at an architecture firm in New York City. And some of my coworkers were attending a Latin Mass there, and they were talking about it at lunch. And I said, "What are you talking about?" "Oh, well, we go to a Latin Mass, you know, here in this, you know, whatever church it was. I had no idea back in the 90s whether it was." And I said, "They still do that?" I had no idea. I thought that that was dead, dead, dead. I said, "No, no, you should come sometime." And you know, being a curious person, I wanted to do that, but I just, you know, I was also young and foolish, and I thought, well, you know, when I have time. And you know how that goes, you know, if you say when I have time, that's never. So I never went, but now I was getting to the point where I was responsible for 4 little souls, including my own, and I thought, well, maybe that's the answer to the problem. You know, maybe I should check that out. So I resolved to find a church that offered the Latin Mass, and like most people, you know, I got on the Google machine and I Googled Latin Mass and found Ecclesia Dei's website and their you know, comprehensive list of all of the Latin Mass parishes. And I found one that was the closest to us, and some Sunday somehow I managed to get away and go give it a try. Well, I was lost, utterly lost. I mean, you know, they had extra missals and everything, and I kept looking over the shoulders of the people next to me as discreetly as I could. That picture's not in my... I mean, and that never works, right? You know, I ended up doing a mix of just kind of trying to sort of watch what was going on, and maybe just sort of reading some of those psalms. There were so many psalms. So that was really, you know, one of the first things that started to strike me as I was trying to read through this missal, where, you know, I mean, the very first thing that you get to is a psalm, and I'm starting to really enjoy what's in there. And you know, I had assumed when I went that the Mass would be more or less the same. But even though, you know, they had the Kyrie and the Gloria and the Creed and the consecration, you know, it wasn't the same animal. And so I was really sitting up and taking notice. Before I knew it, the moment of consecration came, and I looked up at the altar, and for the first time in my life, I got it. I got it for the first time in my life. You know, I was seeing for the first time what Mass was really supposed to be like. It was sort of like as if we were dancing all around it before, but never quite getting to the point. And there was always this hole in the middle that there was something missing. You didn't know what it was. And there it was. That's what we were missing the whole time. And so at that moment, I remember you could hear a pin drop in that chapel, except for the bells. Every bat of every eye, every single breath that everyone in that chapel was taking was all focused on one thing and one thing alone. And that was the host that was being raised for all of us to gaze upon and worship. And God's presence in that place was so thick, it was palpable. You could reach out and touch it. It was like electric. And it was that moment that I felt deeply, madly in love with the Latin Mass. And so I started going every Sunday, and even though I was lost, I was okay with that. They had a low Mass at 7 a.m., and the chapel was about 30 or 40 minutes from our house. And I had a new baby at this time, so I would wake up at 5:30 in the morning, and I would nurse the baby, and I would bundle him into the car, and I would go to the Latin Mass with him. And I would get back just in time to sort of get everybody up, get them all dressed, and get them all ready, and get back in the car and go to Big Mass. You know, I really hate calling it that, but I have to be fair. I mean, that's kind of really what it was for us, at least in that parish. God forgive me. So you know, I would go to Mass with the rest of the family. Now, of course, none of you know me personally, but I can tell you that I am a major night owl. I do not do mornings, and coffee does not help. So my husband looked upon what I was doing with a pretty healthy dose of skepticism. And at one point, he finally got up the courage to ask me, so, how long do you think you'll keep doing this? Because all my life, I have slept in as long as I could. And he knew if I was getting up at 5:30 in the morning, there was no way that was going to last. So he was sort of in shock when I looked at him and I said, no, this is the new normal. There is no going back. I cannot go back. I mean, obviously I was still going there with my family, but I had to be fed. I had all of these years wandering in the desert, and thank you, God, for manna, but I want the watermelons, and I want, I want the good stuff. So, it took a little while before I was able to really convince him to come with me, to check it out. And I can't blame him for being reticent, because doing this was not merely a matter of which liturgy we preferred, because it was a matter of taking young children from this environment where they had been used to running around, playing with their toys, coloring their pictures, being brought down the hall for, the children's liturgy of the word, all of this nonsense, and drop them into this environment where silence reigned. And so many of these other children obviously had grown up with this, lucky them, and so, they were processing up to this without a sound, my kids are in the, did any of you guys see Panic in the Pews, the book that, that was my kids. And don't get me wrong, it's not that the children in that book or that my children were bad, they're just children. That's what we all went through at one point, right? And my oldest was just reading, and they were young and they were crazy, but they were still looking at what was happening up there. You couldn't, how could anyone miss it, really? But they had no tools whatsoever, no way of being able to process any of that. They had no idea why Mommy was bringing us here, but they wanted to know, they were curious. That's what children, that's the way that they're built. Their brains are sponges, and they just aren't designed to absorb everything. But then they reach a point where they want to actually know what it is they're absorbing, so they can start filing it away, right? And, at this time, not only did we have these 4 young children, and the oldest who were getting curious, but we had a baby, we had an 18-month-old who we later would discover that he had Asperger's syndrome. And, in fact, I remember one time I was there by myself, and it must have been a holy day of obligation, because my husband was not with me. And I had the little baby in his carrier, and I went up to communion, and he was sleeping, so I couldn't get him out, so I had to bring the carrier, and I've got my 18-month-old, and I go up to receive communion, and when I got up to go back to my seat, my 18-month-old, I don't know what it was, he must have thought something was interesting up on the altar, and I don't remember if he was actually trying to climb over the altar rail to get up there or what. But at any rate, he was not going anywhere. He was not going back to the seat. He wanted to go up there, and I'm trapped because I've got the baby carrier. I can't pick him up, and I'm kind of trying. And you're standing in front of the whole entire church, right? Up at the altar rail, and everyone's going. And I wish that the floor would just kind of open up and absorb me into it. And thank God, finally one of the mothers that was sort of in the front kind of came up and just picked him up and swooped us out. And she was like, "It's okay, honey, we've all been through it one time." So thank God for that. So you can see, we hardly had a chance to even experience the Mass at all, because we were just so busy playing circus tamers, like I was talking about last night. And the thing is that this transitional period was not only hard on us. I mean, it was unfortunately somewhat disruptive to the others, because they were all, they were used to the silence that was there. And I think at that point they probably didn't really get that many newcomers, especially ones like me with lots of noisy kids. So I really can't blame them for being frustrated. I'm sure that they really were trying hard to be charitable. But it was a small chapel, and every little sound just echoed through the whole place. And it was so small that even though there was a vestibule that you could take the kids out to, there were no doors, and so all of the noise still just came in. So it was extremely stressful for everyone involved. And I so wished that there were some place that was transitional where you could take the inmates from the church and sort of, get them ready before you turn them loose in this wonderful chapel. But that doesn't happen, it was either or. And we could either continue, attending this parish where, every once in a while when our Lord was on the floor, nobody really did anything about it. Or we could go someplace where that was unthinkable. And, for me, there just was no, there is no decision there. So we kept going, and we soldiered on. And eventually our sacrifices paid off. And it helped that we did find another church with the Latin Mass in downtown Chicago. Most people in the know about the Latin Mass community are very much aware of St. John Cantus in Chicago, and that's where we went. And it was an even bigger sacrifice in terms of the drive. It was much further away, but the nice thing was that with that bigger church, the noise that our children made just sort of got absorbed by the big space, which really helped. And there were a lot of other big families there whose children weren't quite as perfect as some of the children that we had seen at this other chapel. I don't know. They must have come from outer space. I've never seen children that quiet. I don't know what they did. Maybe they had a pill or something. But so we found more of a community there, and that enabled us to be a little bit less stressed out, thank God. But by this point, my children were getting older, and that need to know what was going on was becoming acute. And even though we had been attending the Latin Mass for a year or two at that point, as I was saying before, we were really juggling so much that even we were just kind of getting through. We didn't really have the ability to explain to them what was going on either. So what did I do? Of course, well, when you want to figure out what do, you go online, right? Back to Google. And, I searched for children's books, and I must have gone through a stack of children's books, trying to just throw anything at them that would help them. But the problem with most of the children's books that were available, a decade or so ago, is that most of them were reprints or originals from, the 40s or the 50s or the 60s, from back when the Mass was still being said, and when children grew up with it. So even though they may not know all the particulars or how to follow along or all of that, they at least had that general visual familiarity with it. They had grown up with it, that was the spirituality that was all around them. So they weren't starting from zero. They were starting from maybe 30 or so. But we really were just in the wilderness. We were starting from zero. We needed something to bring them from 0 to 30 before those books could really help them. And so, I remember probably the one that was most helpful was the comic book, Know Your Mass, which I think some of you might be familiar with, which is a really great guide, and it tells them a lot of information, which is great, but it's all in English. And so you gotta, going from 0 to 30 means you have to be able to match up what's happening on the altar with where you are in the book. And if it's only in English and he's speaking in Latin, how do you match the two up? I mean, even us adults, when we're looking at that missal, and you find your place finally in Latin, like, oh, all right, now you switch over to the English side, and then before you know it, you're lost again. That's nice, it can't be that far away. So, you can't expect children to do that. We're doing it, but, So, at this point, we were already doing some homeschooling, and I'm a really big fan of the Montessori method. Huge fan. So for catechesis, I was trying to do a little bit of a modified homeschool version of some of the catechesis of the Good Shepherd. And so for some of the Bible stories, we had little Fontanini figurines of like the Annunciation, the Visitation, and the Nativity. And then I made these little booklets to go with that, so they could read, the story directly from the scripture, and move the little figurines and all that stuff. And I had beautiful pictures. So I had kind of already been doing a little bit of this, assembling these little books. So I thought, well, you know, if there's nothing out there that can help them, maybe I can find something that I can put together for them that will help. And I remembered at the chapel we had gone to, they would take the kids, and instead of taking them out of the Mass, they would just take them over, and there was an adult that would sit with them and would kind of help them, and they had these binders that had, you know, the parts of the Mass and the pictures, and I remember looking at them, but even there, the Mass was in English. And I'm like, no, we need Latin. So, you know, back to the internet, and I thought I'd find, you know, the online text so I could just cut and paste, because I wasn't going to try and type out the entire Missal in Latin. I was blind doing that. So, what did I find when I went online but an interlinear translation of the Mass, where each and every word had an English subtitle underneath it, so that you could look and see what each and every word meant. And that proverbial light bulb went off in my head, and I thought, that's the answer. Because if you could hear what the priest is saying, and, you know, if you could find where that is in your missal, you know, matching it up with what he's doing, and then the word is right underneath it. You don't have to switch back and forth between the two pages and always be losing your place. So that's what I did. I took that, and I created this binder for them, and they very graciously lent me their binders at that chapel so I could use their pictures. And I put those together so that there was a whole missal, not just some of the prayers. The whole thing was there with the pictures, and then I went through, and, you know, I had realized that there were all of these different cues to look for. So I made a chart that I put in the front of the binder that had all those cues, and the obvious ones we talked about yesterday with bells, right? Or the few times when, you know, the priest is praying silently, and then he turns around and faces the congregation and speaks out loud, right? These are the things that we look for to help us find our place in the missal. And so I made that chart in front so that they could, you know, oh, I heard that, here, oh, page 35, okay. You know, so you had an additional way of being able to find where you were in the Mass. So that was it, just a binder with pages and little plastic protectors, and as more people saw this little guide that I had made for my kids, they wanted copies. And so I started out by doing that, and then I had enough people that wanted it that I had heard about this online book printing place called Lulu. And so I uploaded the PDF that I had made from this, and we printed it out as books and shared that with the rest of the homeschool group. So all of a sudden, you know, we went from just, you know, these pages and plastic protectors. Now it was actually a book. And we called it Learning to Follow the Mass. And many of you might have seen it on my table. This is it. This is what it was. You know, it really hasn't changed since then. And that was just in plastic protectors. And in fact, you know, a lot of times when people say, well, this is such a big book, and it gets beat up, and it's only paperback, and I'm like, just cut the binding off and put it in plastic page protectors in a binder, and it'll make it a little more sturdy, and, you know, if they drop it on the floor, no one's going to care, right? You know, you replace the binder. So, you know, so that wasn't so exciting, was it, right? You know, just a mom trying to help her kids, and it's pretty natural. And I thought I was all done with that, and you know, we're done, right? But remember God's sense of humor? No, he needs a big laugh. and you know, by now, you know, also I'd been making all these guides up to now, right? And now I knew how to actually get them printed as books. So I was like, what do I do next? And you know, I already mentioned the Panic in the Pews book, that I was still dealing with my kids not behaving during Mass, and I remembered when I was young having a little book that showed certain things you weren't supposed to do, like, you know, when you're kneeling, you're resting your butt on the pew, right? And it's saying, you know, I remember this picture of this little girl with her butt on the pew, she's kind of like, and I wanted to find this book, but I couldn't find it. And so I had a friend whose daughter was really good at caricatures, and I said, I have this great idea. If I write up all these silly little poems that are kind of like the Goops, which are all sort of reverse psychology, saying, you know, like all these terrible things that these kids are doing, can you make really funny illustrations to match it? So that's what we did. So we made that. So next thing we knew, my children were going through their catechesis and getting their first communion. There was a mom in our homeschool group who did a wonderful class with the kids that taught them really, I remember she told me, my job is to get them to love Jesus, and he'll do the rest. And at the time I was like, I don't know, I'm going to Latin Mass, and how are you going to get them to love Jesus? Are you going to try to get them to love Jesus the same way they tried to get me to love Jesus? Because that didn't work. But the way that she was getting them to love Jesus was by handing them the King of the Golden City. And that works. So at some point, after I think one or two of my children had gone through this class, and I was seeing the sea change in them and how they really, really did love Jesus. And they would come to me and say, "Can I go to confession?" God bless you. Yes. Yeah. And I realized I had to get in line with them, because I had been avoiding confession all this time too, because I remember face-to-face confession, which I think scarred me for life. So at this, at some point, the mom who was teaching this class, she knew that I was publishing these books, and she came to me and she said, "I've been thinking of publishing what I do as a sort of curriculum so that other people could do it." I was like, well, yeah. I mean, look at my kids. I didn't do that. So we started going through some of the materials that she was using, because she had really taken a lot of these from older books back when she was teaching in Virginia a few decades before. And, they had been photocopied into absolute mud. And so I said, okay, first thing we're going to do, we're going to try and see if we can find originals so that we can scan them in nice and clean, and that can be part of the little booklet that we're going to publish for you. So really all I knew about some of the older books that she was using was that they were Mother Mary Loyola, the King of the Golden City, and she had at that time had First Confession, and those were the only two she had. So I thought, well, maybe the illustrations came from those books. So I went online and I'm finding Mother Mary Loyola, and at this point things got really interesting, because it was at that point that I found the Internet Archive. Do any of you know this? The Internet Archive is all these libraries around the world have scanned these old books and posted them online, so you actually have the whole PDF of the whole book. I'm a book person. Did you know this? On the Internet Archive, I found that Mother Mary Loyola did not just publish these 2 books. She had written over 24 books. And I'm sure that some of you out there haven't really heard of her, and some of you may have not heard of King of the Golden City, so that may not mean much to you, but in that moment, she went from just some obscure name in this book that was really great to being my hero. And I knew that I wanted to have these books for my family and for my children. And so I never did find any of those illustrations that Kathy needed for her book. And it's not that I didn't care, it's not that I lost that. I was still on the lookout for them. I never did find any of the books that they came from. But, let's do the addition here, right? I knew how to make PDFs into books, and here were millions of PDFs of really good books, and I wanted them for my children, so do the math, and now there you have it. And at that point, I was pregnant with my 6th child, and it had been a difficult pregnancy, and I just so happened to have time because I was having to really rest and keep my legs up, so I was propping myself up in front of the computer with my giant belly and turning these books, these PDFs, into books. And before you know it, somebody said, you should really bring those to the homeschool conference and sell those. I bet that a lot of people would want those. So that was the birth of my little publishing company, St. Augustine Academy Press. I was loving it because I was really passionate about Mother Mary Loyola, and being able to publish this stuff was such a blessing. And so here we are, sitting at this homeschool conference, and selling these books and thinking, wow, this is kind of cool. And then God's sense of humor kicks in again. You thought it was all over, right?
Yeah.
So did I.
Yeah.
This priest comes up to our table and he's looking at Mother Mary Loyola's books, and he's got a very serious look on his face. And I'm thinking, what am I dealing with here? Does he hate it? Does he love it? Do you know Mother Mary Loyola? Oh, yes. Okay, all right, I don't need to tell you anything. So then he comes over and he finds, Learning to Follow the Mass, and he's looking through it. Did you do this? Yes. How did you do this? What program did you use? Microsoft Word? No, you can't. You have to use InDesign. This is good, but it needs to be better. I didn't know what to say. So it turns out that this was Father Jim Socias, who's the head of the Midwest Theological Forum, and they published a number of wonderful books and Bibles. And so he says to me, "You are going to meet with my editor-in-chief, and he's going to tell you how to make this book better." Now, let me remind you, I was 8 months pregnant. My sixth child was on the way, and I'd been, propping up my feet, pumping out all these books, right? My husband was really tired. And I'm supposed to meet with this editor-in-chief. Okay, all right, so I was obedient. I said, okay, I met with his editor, and he gave me all these wonderful ideas. He showed me Bishop Fultonsheen's This is the Mass, and all of the beautiful, beautiful photographs in here. And so he's saying, you should really make this into a beautiful coffee table book that anyone can be proud to have on their coffee table. And you'll probably need new photographs, but now wait just a cotton pick and many new photographs. Who did they think they were talking to? I was due in a month. I'd had a difficult pregnancy. My husband was tapping his foot going, when are you going to stop doing this? My background was in architecture, 5 kids under the age of 10. I am not your guy, I thought. I don't know how to do this. And God didn't listen to Moses when he said that. So it took me a while because I had a new baby on my hands. But I did happen to have a friend with a background in graphic design. And she gamely offered to train me in InDesign. And so she sat down with me, and really she helped me through the whole process. And anytime I had a question, she'd sit down with me. Anytime I needed design advice, she'd help me out. And she even made the little diagrams that are in Treasure and Tradition. And so, really, I started by just sort of collecting all the best books that I could find about the Mass. Dom Guéranger, Maria Montessori, James Luke Mager, I'm going to draw a blank. All these great books, probably not anything quite of the level that Louis Tofari has, because that's just above my pay grade. I don't read in Latin. But I started sort of just reading through these and gleaning some of the best tidbits from them, and I just took pages from Learning to Follow the Mass, and I would have a blank page next to it, and I would just start sort of conglomerating each little gem of information with the the part of the Mass that it went with. And my sister had done some book publishing, and so she helped me sort of organize all the information, and there was a wonderful priest who gave me just so much wonderful advice about all of this. And little by little, over the course of 4 years, Treasure and Tradition came into shape. And so for those of you who haven't seen it, I just thought I'd show you real quick and explain some of it. So, this is basically Learning to Follow the Mass right here. You've got your interlinear translation. A lot of people had complained that when they would read the English that it was like, what does that mean? So we put the regular English here so you could figure it out. We had the diagrams that matched the chart up here in front. we have the pictures again. We actually did manage to get a photo shoot. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But then all those gems of information ended up on this page, and we sort of tried to relate to whatever was happening here so that we, could expand that out and give people really not just the mass, but all of this other information too. And we added the front section with all the sort of what I call FAQs, the vessels and the vestments and the difference between low and high mass, all of the typical questions that newcomers to the Latin Mass would have that would help sort of orient them. So, this came together, and you can see why it took a long time. And the story about the photos is actually really funny because I kept asking, every time I'd find, a really a good traditional priest, I'm like, so I'm making this this guide, and I need photographs. I need to take photographs of during the Mass. And I was just wondering, and I was like, don't even talk to me. I mean, all of our good traditional priests, they're so overwhelmed. They're working so hard, and they just didn't have time for someone to come in and spend a whole entire day photographing them. And it really wasn't until I actually sent my book to the diocese to get an imprimatur, and I borrowed the photos from the beautiful St. Edmund Campion Missal and just used them as placeholders. And I made a quick note saying, I'm not plagiarizing, I'm not stealing, these are just placeholders, we'll get our own photos, but this will show you what I plan to have in each photo. And I heard from the diocesan censor, he had just a couple of minor questions about some of the things that were in there. And he's like, so these placeholders, what's up with that? And I explained to him, I just can't find anyone who has time. And he said, well, you can come to my parish and we'll do it. Yeah, we'll do it. So, how time? You want me to do this? You gotta send me what I need. So there you go. There you had it. And it was finally finished. And, all this time, I was always amazed by the organic process by which it just came together. And anytime I needed something, finally by the end, I learned to just go to St. Joseph. Why I didn't do that before. It's because I was never trained to do that when I was a kid, All right. But so yeah, it came together, and we took it to the printer, and in order to sort of get the cost ratio right, we thought, well, we're going to have to print 3,000 copies of this. Now up to now, right? I've been using Lulu, right? I've just been printing online and getting a couple copies at a time. So we thought, okay, well, 3,000 copies. It's going to take a long time to sell all those, but well, it's okay. We'll print 3,000 copies. But I had no idea. I always thought that this would help people because I knew it would help me, and I knew it was helping the few people that I had given sort of advanced copies to. But I had no idea we had hit such a nerve, because so many people out there are thirsting for this. They all have been wandering in the wilderness, and for some reason, we don't have Moses yet, or Joshua, I guess in this case, to take us over the Jordan, and we're all just sort of straggling and dragging ourselves across there, right? And so those 3,000 copies were gone. It came out very end of October, early November in 2014, and by January we were sold out of those 3,000 copies already. And by now we've actually sold over 10,000 copies.
Wow.
And I never in a million years dreamed of that. Really, I'm just a mom. I was just trying to help my kids. Probably I was drawing on some of the experiences I had from architecture school, which basically was just boot camp, and so all the all-nighters and all of the, just this, I have a stubborn streak a mile wide, but this book didn't spring out of my brain. I'm not an expert on any of this. I just was a mom who wanted to help my kids. And so my message to you is, God has something in mind for all of you, and I hope for your sakes that it's not to do what I'm doing. But who knows? And as long as you are listening to what God is saying to you, He's going to be able to use you to change other people's lives, even if it's only just your children's or even just your friends or your parents or whoever. All of you are touching people, and so, you know, keep up the good fight, and we're all soldiers everyone together. So, thank you very much. I'm praying that none of you have any questions like yesterday's. Just kidding. Actually, those are really good. Yes?
Of course I have a question. It's a strange question. I can't answer it if you don't have a book, but you have a photograph on page 26 that I don't understand.
On his treasure.
This photograph.
I might not understand.
It just doesn't fit with things I'm used to.
You mean the painting?
Yes, I'm just not familiar with it. What's going on there?
My understanding is that is Saint Julia, if I recall correctly. I don't really know her full story, but I think she was one of the early Roman martyrs. And if this illustration is correct, she was crucified. I mean, you know, as I was going through and illustrating this book, I knew that primarily I wanted artwork that was timeless, that would express these things, because so much of what I had grown up with was all of these 60s deconstructionist, you know, ugly illustrations, ugly on-purpose illustrations, which I really will never understand. And so part of the reason why it took me so long to put this together was that, you know, when I wanted to express something without words, I had to have just the right illustration. And, you know, when we think about the sacrifice of the altar, we think of the cross, obviously. And at this point, we're talking about how, you know, in the Mass, the priest is offering Christ's sacrifice. Again, obviously now it's unbloody. But during the offertory, we are supposed to be placing ourselves on the platen and offering ourselves up as well. And so when I saw this illustration, I felt like that really got that across, like a sucker punch to the gut, where we can be on the cross too in our own ways. And so when I saw, you know, St. Julia here on the cross, I was saying to myself, wow, that's just a really powerful expression of, you know, she gave the ultimate sacrifice, obviously, and was blessed enough to be able to die in the same way that our Lord did. If you can, I'm sure she didn't feel about it that way at the time, but I don't know, her face looks pretty serene, but I don't know, is that
Yes,
helpful?
thank you very much.
Anyone else?
What kind of future does your publishing company have at this point?
Only God knows that, I guess, right? I mean, I can tell you in a very quick nutshell what we're really working on right now, which I'm actually really excited about. See, you know, the funny thing about doing this is that, you know, every single time I'm doing something, it's usually God sort of keeps throwing things at me, and I'm terrible at sports. I can't catch or throw or kick or any of that stuff. And so he's gotten really tired of throwing things at me and me not catching them. So really what he does is he throws it right at my head so that I'll know that he's thrown something at me. And I usually kind of have to look around and say, what? What did you, what? Where is, what? So yeah, it takes me a while. But, you know, he threw this at me a couple of years ago and I'm only just finally getting it. We are republishing a catechism series from the 1930s. Called Highway to Heaven, and it's, you know, grades 1 through 8, the graded catechism books. And the thing that I'm really so excited about with this series, not only is it just so beautiful, which of course it just immediately is appealing. I was just talking to Father Jackson this morning. I was asking him how did he become Catholic, especially considering, you know, what's going on in the church right now. And as he was telling me his story, I'm like, oh, it was truth and beauty. You combine those two, and it's just hard to argue. You can argue against it all you want, but it just isn't going anywhere. And so just the fact that these are so beautiful just right away, and then the fact that that beauty is carrying the truth in it. So you've got that, but the teacher's manuals are chock full of the best possible catechism resources available at that time, which was late 20s, early 30s. And I spent all summer long just slowly building, like finding them all, either on the internet or begging or borrowing and amassing. I think I've actually, I'm started on my third shelf, on my bookshelf of all of these books. And they're amazing. They use, most of them use, and some of you may know this more than I do, the Munich method of catechism, which I guess was a reaction to the sort of dry, you can recite the Baltimore Catechism, and obviously that's your go-to source for getting it right. And you need the catechism for that, because it's right there, and it's in black and white, and especially when you've memorized that, it becomes part of who you are. But with young children, even though they're good at memorizing, that stuff is just going right past them. Whereas, just like what my friend was trying to do in that first communion class, my job is to make them love Jesus, and he will take care of the rest. And it's largely true. I mean, you want them to know the catechism too. That's the problem, is that they told me that Jesus loved me, and then they didn't give me anything else. You teach them that Jesus loves them, and you really actually have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. But then when you really, really do love him, and then you start giving them more and more of the catechism, and you start feeding them, and you get to the point where they can take strong meat. That's the process that really, really creates, that strong bedrock of faith that's just not going to be shaken by the winds out there. And so that's why I am so excited about these books, because that's the method that they use. This Munich method was saying, okay, let's not discard the catechism like they did later, but let's start talking to children the way that we talk to children, not dumbing things down, but sort of, talking to them and drawing them along. And I really feel like, I don't know whether Mother Mary Loyola was a predecessor to that movement, or whether she was either knowingly or unknowingly part of that movement. It was happening right around the time, or just slightly after the time, that she was writing First Communion and some of her catechetical works. But clearly that's the type of method that she's using. It's a narrative. She's talking to the children, and she's drawing them in through her own personal charisma and her own ability to sort of tell stories and interest them, and then drawing them along with her and saying, come see, here he is. And so they actually do reference a lot of Mother Mary Loyola in these teachers' manuals. They really recommend, a lot of her books, so I knew it had to be good. So we are working our way through reprinting as much of that as possible. We've got the textbooks printed. Some of you may have seen those. What we're trying to do with the teachers' manuals is not tinker with them, but take at least some of the resources and get them in there so that you can be using those. And some of the way that the lessons are laid out is not linear, and so it's a little confusing. So we may just rearrange what's there just so that it's easier to use. So that's probably going to be another year at least for us to get through that. But then all of these other resources will be kind of working on at the same time. Additional children's books, especially for the very youngest children. So yeah, I've got my work cut out for me.
As you know, this is being streamed live on Facebook.
Oh, that's true.
And there are a number of people who have written very affirming things to what you've just said, very much in agreement. I have several questions here, people asking, how do I get a copy of these things?
Okay.
So could you give us some information? Because this is being streamed live, but it's also recorded.
Right.
So people can come back and look at it later.
Well, the easiest way probably is through my website, which is St. Augustine Academy Press, and that's www.staaapress.com, staaapress.com. The textbooks are also available on Amazon, both in softcover and in hardcover. Right now, that's all we have is just the textbooks. and we are working as quickly as we can through the teacher's manuals, because really, especially for the earlier years, there's a great deal of the pedagogical information really in the teacher's manuals. And the book is just meant to be, something for the kids to sort of hold on to and look at the pictures and fall in love with the pictures, So, I hope that's
Okay.
Are there any other questions? I'm sure you're ready for me to be done
Where-
talking, right?
Where do you go to Mass now on a regular basis? Or should I not have asked that?
I love God's sense of humor. Right as I was finishing up Treasure and Tradition, in fact, just before I had the pictures taken, we moved to a house that is literally right next door to a Byzantine Catholic church, and it's a very beautiful, very reverent liturgy, and the pastor there is on fire. He's just a wonderful, wonderful pastor of souls, and you really just cannot argue with the convenience of crossing your backyard on Sunday morning. You always pray that God will bring you closer to Him. You never really expect it to be quite in that way, but it's been such a blessing for our family to live that close to a really good church, and we've really become involved in the parish life in very big ways, because when they have stuff going on, it's like, hey, can you help us out? We're right next door. How do you say no, right? Oh, I'm too busy. No, actually I'm not. So we most of the time we're just crossing the backyard and actually going to the Byzantine liturgy. Every once in a while, though, I have to have my Latin Mass, because that is really my first love. So if we go to the Latin Mass, usually we go to St. John Cantius. So, all right. Well, thank you so much for your attention. God bless all of you. Keep me in your prayers if you would.
Thank you.